Hi, and welcome to a REV'IT YouTube Live with our guest, James Barkman. My name is Tracy Motz. I'm a senior brand manager at REV'IT USA. And we are bringing you this series in an effort to spotlight some of our adventure heroes who we think are most pushing the envelope and really exploring boundaries of adventure and what it means to be an adventure rider. We are really excited to have James here today because more than anyone else, he exemplifies the adventure spirit. In 2017, he and two of his friends purchased a trio of Suzuki DR650s, and they planned a trip from Alaska to Argentina, but their intention was to climb the highest peaks along the way. So James, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm stoked.
If we could start, could you just give us a little overview of who you are, how the idea for the trip came up, and how you guys prepared for it, meaning financially, how did you purchase the bikes, just the whole start of your process?
Sure. So I'll start sharing my some photos in a second, but a little bit about who I am. Like I said, my name's James Barkman. I'm a photographer, but I'm also a climber, rider, moto guy. I mean, I kind of do a number of different things, but that's kind of who I am. I'm a photographer by trade. And this whole idea for this trip started with my friend Alan. There was three of us that decided to do this, and I have to give him the credit. So Alan and I and Jeremy, we all grew up together. We were kind of childhood friends. And Alan had the idea to ride from Alaska to Patagonia as soon as he graduated from college. So when we were teenagers, we're like, man, when we graduate from college, first thing we're gonna do is get cheap dirt bikes and ride the Pan Am. So one day Alan gave me a call, and this was kind of a dream we all had. We talked about, everyone kind of talks about the things they want to do. So one day Alan gives me a call. He's like, hey man, I'm riding the Pan Am starting in like May or spring of 2017. With or without you, you're gonna come or not? So I was like, for sure I'm gonna come. So that kind of started the whole thing off when we put it on the map. We all worked about or as much as we could for about a year prior to the trip. And kind of the challenging thing about this trip was we didn't really want to do it, completely sponsored. We wanted to just do our own thing. We didn't want the commitment of like having, to shoot stuff all the time. We just wanted to do our trip. So it was kind of interesting balance between getting support from brands. Obviously REV'IT, definitely IBOC was a huge sponsor for suspension. Some of our gear sponsors were Mountain Hardware and Thermarest for like the climbing and that side of things. So it was an interesting balance, like navigating all of that. But essentially we looked on Craigslist for our bikes. We found all of them for around $1,500 on Craigslist.
Where were they when you found them?
Alan and Jeremy's bikes were in Pennsylvania on Craigslist, and I kind of live on the road. I've lived on the road for the past 6 years in my VW bus. So I was on the West Coast at the time. I was looking on Craigslist in Pennsylvania, couldn't find any DRs. And I was like, man, what do I do? I was looking all over the US. And so I found one in Arizona. I had a plane ticket booked to just go get it because the trip was coming, pretty fast, and I still didn't have my bike. And we were kind of on a shoestring budget to begin with. So we're like, we have $1,500 for a bike. Let's find one for that price range. So I had a ticket booked for Arizona. And right before I flew out, I found one in California in Santa Barbara. So I got it there, and then actually rode up from Oregon and met Alan and Jeremy coming from Pennsylvania, and we met in Canada. But getting a little ahead of myself, I guess. But for the most part, let me start my screen sharing, actually. Sure. I'll start sharing some photos from...
And while you're bringing that up, could you take us into where along the way the idea to also make this a mountaineering trip came in?
Absolutely. So originally, this was kind of a riding trip. It was Alan's idea. It was kind of his brainchild. And he's like, let's ride. This is the hardest thing I can think of doing, like the most challenging trip. Let's ride the Pan Am. And I realized that we were going to be passing through all these crazy mountain ranges. And as a climber, I was like, man, don't think I could live with myself if we literally ride through these insane mountain ranges and don't climb anything. So it kind of morphed into this idea like, man, what if we climbed the whole way, starting with Mount Denali in Alaska? So immediately we were like, yeah, for sure, we want to do that. So immediately, you can see my screen all right, right? Yeah.
We can see. And we see that by no means are these standard adventure touring bikes. You guys have a lot packed on there. So it must have been a big process to get all the climbing gear plus the moto gear for this giant expedition onto those bikes.
Absolutely. As soon as it became a climbing trip, we're like, how do we fit all the gear we need on our bikes? So a big part of preparation was figuring out our panniers and luggage system. So we looked at hard luggage, we looked at soft luggage, everything was too expensive because climbing gear, especially mountaineering and high alpine gear, is definitely not cheap by any means. So in addition to like working on our bikes, trying to save money for the next year and a half to 2 years, you know, getting the moto gear we needed, getting the climb gear we needed, we're definitely strapped. So we ended up getting a small business that I'm part owner to make us these leather moto panniers. So it's kind of a one-off custom thing. Each side was 40 liters. The front tank bags were about 15 liters. And then we had like a duffel bag, which you can see on the back that was about 100 liters. So throughout the trip, initially, like we had like a backpack on the back. And as the trip progressed, we kind of figured out our stride and system. So what you see here is kind of ended up being my system the rest of the trip. But definitely fitting.
Is this picture in Alaska or is this later on as your system had already evolved?
This picture is kind of, it's definitely as it evolved. This was actually in Arizona or Nevada, one of the others, one of the two.
So before we get too far ahead of ourselves, if I could just jump back a minute to Alaska. So you guys rode up to Denali, which is a place where probably most of our viewers who are on the line today will never get to experience for themselves. Could you just tell us a little bit about what it was like? Oh, whoa, that's an awesome shot.
A little more perspective of the gear we had.
Of everything that went. What was it like to ride through some of the harshest conditions in the Americas?
That was kind of some of the gnarliest riding we did the whole trip. I kind of blend Alaska into this whole like northern region idea. So let me find some photos here. This was Dead Horse. This was on the ride up to the Arctic. So kind of Dead Horse is definitely, you know, the tip of the Arctic, which is where we essentially started the Pan American. I mean, my friends, like I mentioned, rode from Pennsylvania and I rode from Oregon. But Dead Horse is definitely, you know, kind of as gnarly as it gets. But the Northern Territories in general, it's all about the same. It's either below freezing and snowy or icy, or just above freezing and cold and rainy, which you see here in this photo. So that was some of the most challenging riding we ever had. I'll just go through some of these photos to kind of give you a visual reference. This was, again, in the Arctic. This is kind of what happens when you wake up in the morning. It's snowy, it's cold. It's the last thing you want to do is get on your bike and ride. Some of these aren't necessarily organized, so I'll just kind of go through photos. So bear with me.
Looks like a lot of mud.
A lot of mud.
And if I'm not mistaken, you and your friends got split up for a bit in Alaska. Is that true?
Yeah, so I guess I'm still kind of getting ahead of myself, but I'll just kind of blast through the whole timeline. So the trip became like a climbing trip. We ended up climbing Denali initially. So we rode up to Alaska to kind of, you know, get on the mountain in time for climbing season. After Denali, we decided, and one thing to kind of keep in mind was that the whole trip, because it had become a climbing trip, we were moving south with the weather and climbing seasons. So sometimes we're like, okay, we have 2 or 3 months to stay in this area because if we go to the next region, like it'll be too early for climbing. So that being said, after Denali, we're like, we have a few months to kill before we, you know, climb in the Canadian Rockies. So let's just work. So we kind of all ended up working for this summer. Alan worked on a fishing boat in Alaska. Jeremy got some random dog sledding gig on a glacier. And I actually had a photo project that I flew to the lower 48 for. So that was kind of what we did for the summer. And then after that, we got together and rode back up to Dead Horse, which is where this photo's from right now. This was Yukon. Here's a photo of starting a bike early in the morning. Sometimes we had to kind of jump all our bikes together because it was too cold. One of the batteries a little weak on some, they wouldn't start. It was just absolutely hectic. Here you can kind of see the fatigue and just what it's like to ride, you know, from sun up to sundown in the Arctic.
This is a real testament to Suzuki. I mean, even snow covered, they were starting. It's pretty amazing. It looks like you weren't seeing a ton of people up there. All of these
not necessarily, mostly truckers.
Stark. Mostly
yeah, this was a pass in the Arctic called Adigan Pass. Actually, right before this, we wrecked our bikes on the snow and like tried to get them up. There's semis coming, you know, the semis can't stop because it's all snow and ice. Got our bikes off the road, and this is the photo right after that. So all that to say that the North is just one of the gnarliest riding experiences I've ever had. I definitely got frost nipped a number of times, and I feel like there's just really no way to explain how miserable it is, but at the same time how beautiful it is. I think I speak for all of us when I say like the most beautiful landscapes we experienced were in the Arctic and in Alaska, because fall was kind of peaking out at the time. So it was just incredible. And I think whenever you have really hard, challenging type dynamics, you have equally, you know, beautiful and rewarding experiences. So that's kind of the beauty and the misery of riding through Alaska and Canada.
The hardest moments sometimes always become the most memorable. It's really beautiful, but yeah, it looks like it was very hard. So not to push you through the story too quickly, but after Alaska, you guys continued down into the lower 48. And when you were going through from North America to South America, there's a famous crossing, and you have to go from Panama to Colombia. And you basically, the option is to either ship your bike or face the infamous Darien Gap, which almost no one does. So in an article for Iron and Air, and this really stood out to me because it was so nonchalant, you had written an article and you said, in Panama, we squeezed our bikes into a shipping container and planned to meet them in Colombia in 2 days. 2 days became 2 weeks. Our first night back on the road, we were robbed. We were robbed again the next night too. And nothing more is said about it. So can you go into what happened crossing between the two continents? And sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. For all of you who are joining us from home, please use the chat function to ask your questions. We'll collect questions at the end, and we will address those with James at the end of the live stream.
For sure. So yeah, the Darien Gap, which you mentioned, is kind of the only separation between, you know, the Pan Am. So for those of you who don't know, the Pan American Highway is essentially a road system, and it's the longest continuous road system in the world. It's about 30,000 miles. Till it was all said and done, we did upwards of 38,000. But it's broken up in between Panama and Colombia. So a lot of people think that, which I didn't realize this, but a lot of people think that Panama and Colombia are separated with the canal, but that's not true. The canal just like allows ships to go through. It's actually connected. You know, the landmass is connected. It's just undeveloped. So the Darien Gap is about, I think it's only 60 miles or 160 miles, something, you know, not too extraordinary. It's that, you know, area that's completely undeveloped, just jungle, swamp. It's inhabited by guerrillas and FARC rebels. It's gnarly. You'll probably get kidnapped and get your head cut off if you try to do it. So we ended up shipping our bikes in a shipping container around the gap, and we took plane flight and landed in Cartagena, Colombia. So the process can be, you know, like a smooth kind of 3-step type thing, or it can drag out to this incredibly complicated, stressful situation, which was definitely our case. So when we shipped the bikes, They were like, yeah, they're gonna come in 2 days. Like 2 days they'll be in Cartagena. So we got an Airbnb, took, you know, pretty much the clothes on our backs because we're like, we'll have our bikes and everything, all our stuff in 2 days. Ended up being 2 weeks. Every day they're like, yeah, the ship is lost. We don't know where it is. And we're like, what do you mean it's lost? How do you lose a ship? So every day we're like, where's the ship? And they're like, we don't know, it's lost. And we're like, what, did it sink? Like, are we ever gonna get our bikes? Because there's horror stories of stuff just disappearing, you know, you'd never know.
Getting lost.
So in about, yeah, in about 2 weeks, our bikes finally came. We got them out of the shipping container. We're stoked to get back on the road.
Did they offer any explanation of where they had been?
Oh, absolutely not. It's just it was lost. So when we got our bikes, stoked to get back on the road. And the first night in Colombia, we were camping on some beach, and someone literally stole my cell phone out of the hammock I was sleeping in and stole it.
It was on your person.
It was in a pocket, like on my body.
Wow.
In the hammock, I was sleeping right beside it, stole it right out of it. And I mean, a trip like this, everything you have is so critical and crucial. You know, you don't have a lot of space on a bike, obviously, especially your phone. So it was definitely quite a headache losing your phone in South America. You know, it's like it's like you kind of need your phone more than anything. He stole some other small stuff. So the next night we're like, okay, let's camp. Let's like find a hotel so we're a little safer. So we locked all our bikes up outside this little hotel in a village in the middle of the jungle. And that night, Jeremy's bike was completely cleaned out. Everything was stolen. And we ended up finding some of the climbing gear, thankfully. Whoever stole it was like, they're like, what the heck is this? Yeah, they had no idea what, you know, ice screws and ice axes are for. So we ended up getting stuff, but about like $3,000 worth of gear was stolen. Again, like everything we had was so crucial and critical. Like every article of clothing is so crucial in the mountains, and you know, it's just critical. So that was definitely a kind of an eye opener for us. We're like, okay, we can't take any chances, you know. At that point, you never let your bike out of your sight. You know, you pretty much chain yourself to your bike when you sleep at night. And thankfully, we didn't really have any other incidents, but that was kind of.
How did you recover from that one? I mean, did you just go on without the gear that had been lost? Did you try to replace things? Were you able to recover anything from local police?
Yeah, so that was kind of the headache. We're like, man, what do we do? Do we need to fly back and get, you know, like restock and fly? Like, does Jeremy need to fly back to the States and get stuff? Because like, where do we even ship stuff? We don't know anyone. And that's kind of when the internet community, like Instagram and advrider.com, which is an amazing forum platform. Alan actually has a really detailed trip report of the entire trip. So for those of you that are interested in that, just search the Pan American Trail, and it'll be one of the first things that pops up on ADV Rider for a more like in-depth day-by-day type thing. So ADV Rider people hit us up from Instagram, from other internet platforms, and they're like, hey, we have a shipping address. Some amazing companies like Huckberry, a few other kind of like mountain hardware. They're just like, hey, we'll send you stuff. We'll like next day air it. What do you need? We'll get it to you. So that was a really, really special thing. We're grateful for that. So we were able to get Jeremy everything he lost pretty much in a matter of, you know, I think it was about 2 months later, we got everything. It took a while. And we ended up shipping some stuff to a friend we made in Colombia. We ended up, a friend ended up flying down and like dropping some gear for us. It was pretty crazy, but we got everything back.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. Way to go, Moto community, for rallying on that one. And just for everybody who's watching, who always wonders, they're on this trip, they're doing all this riding, how are they getting these amazing photos? Because it looks effortless always, but we know that there's so much more that goes into making a really beautiful photo than just picking up your phone and snapping. So what was the process of capturing it all as you went along?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was definitely one of the most challenging things for me, because when you're on a motorcycle, everything, you know, you can't just like click cruise control, kick back and like take some photos. You're riding, especially when you're, you know, riding anything technical, or it's raining or snowing or muddy. it's just so hard, and your gear is kind of buried. You can't have your gear out, you know. So that was just something that I kind of learned to I don't know. I guess I don't really have a good answer other than it was just hard throughout the entire trip. There's so many things that happen so quick when you're riding, and it's gone. You know, you missed it. You can't shoot it. So a lot
Right.
of it was kind of thinking ahead, and a big part of it too was communication. We had SENA units, so we could all communicate together, but they're kind of hectic sometimes, and like we've definitely put them through the ringer, so it's hard to calm in sometimes. So a lot of things, all that to say, a lot of things got missed, which is really sad. I feel like we all just have these memories and like, you know, pictures in our mind's eye that no one will ever see, just incredible things, but you couldn't shoot it. It happened and it was gone. So
Right.
I think I learned to think ahead. I learned to just like, you know, try to have cameras and all of that accessible, but sometimes it's just so hard. But yeah, I mean, it was challenging for sure.
Were you calling ahead to your buddies sometimes and saying, "Hey, let's stage a shot," or were you mostly just capturing whatever was happening organically?
My shooting style is definitely very documentary. It's like for sure I'd be like, hey, this is a really rad photo. Like, can you guys ride here? Can we do this again? But for the most part, I try to shoot very, you know, honestly and genuinely. And it's kind of like it's happening, and I shoot it like a lot of these photos. I mean, pretty much everything I shoot is very much, you know, like I mean, with the exception of photos like this, obviously very staged. Everything I shoot is very documentary. It's kind of in the moment. So that was, you know, a challenging part of the trip for sure, because I wanted everything to be honest and pure.
Right.
But yeah, it's tough.
Can't always be 100%. Totally. So just going back to South America, you guys recovered from this crazy mishap. Um, can you tell us a little bit about what happened in Peru?
What happened in Peru in like the kind of throughout the course of the whole time we were there?
When was it in Peru? Maybe I'm mistaking the country where you guys had a very memorable climbing incident.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Peru, I'll just pull up this photo. Peru was kind of I'm trying to think to organize in an interesting way. Peru was definitely my favorite country. I think I speak for all of us when I say that. It's just incredible. This was kind of the, you know, the Holy Grail as far as like climbing objectives go in the trip. We're like, we need to get to Peru. We need to get to the Andes at the beginning of climbing season, and we're going to climb our brains out. So as we were getting there, um, Alan started having like these, and I'll just kind of lead you into the whole story. With everything that happened on this trip, there's so much, you know, that, you know, it goes behind the photos, and I'll just do my best to communicate what actually happened. So as we're getting to Peru, this was kind of the mountain that from the beginning of the trip, I'm like, Alpamayo, this is what I want to climb. I don't care if I don't climb anything else. This is all I want to do. It's just such an iconic and beautiful mountain. This is just kind of a taste of the Peruvian Andes. They're amazing. So we kind of hauled down to get to the Andes in the beginning of climbing season. And as we were doing that, Alan started having really gnarly issues with his knee, and kind of just like overall physical health. And when you're riding, like, you know, we do such crazy mountain passes. And I guess this is probably a good time to share a GoPro video. This is just kind of a taste of the Peruvian Andes. They're amazing. So we kind of followed down to get to the Andes in the beginning of climbing season. Oh, I think I'm playing the YouTube live. There we go. Sorry about that. So this is kind of like a taste of what riding's like. Hopefully that's not too laggy for you guys. I think there's a lot happening on my computer. It might be a little slow. But all that to say that when you're riding hundreds of miles a day through the middle of nowhere, you know, you're wrecking, your bikes are, you know, if we'd fall, we'd have to get help to pick up the bike. So when you fall, you don't really know, like, if sometimes at the end of the day, you're like, oh man, my ankle's like twice the size. I must have fallen on it. Or like, oh man, I think I might have sprained my wrist. Because in
Just
the
because it's
adrenaline,
happening so frequently, you don't
right.
know.
It's just normal life. Every day you're getting hurt. So we're like, man, I think that Alan's like, I think that I might have hurt myself or something. And then as time went on, we realized that it was getting worse and worse. I will pull up a photo that kind of showcases just how miserable Alan was feeling. Bear with me here.
Poor Alan. Seems like a lot happened to Alan on this trip.
You got put through the ringer. So this is Alan after, a few days of riding, thousands of miles. He pretty much had to ride 1,500 miles with his leg stretched out because he couldn't bend his knee because it was so swollen. And this is all, it's getting worse and worse. This is one night. I mean, he's getting pretty sick at this point. I think he had a fever. There's what you can't see is the millions of mosquitoes. It was just awful. So we got to Peru and we're like, I think you need to fly back to the States and get checked out. Like no one knows what's going on. He went to a doctor, they don't know. So he ended up flying back and had Lyme disease. Some of you might know what that is. It's basically caused by a tick. And we're like, man, maybe like it's one of those things that sometimes you can kind of kick it and sometimes you can't. So he was back in the States getting treatment for that while Jeremy and I were in Peru right at this time when like climbing season was starting. So it was kind of a huge bummer because we didn't know if Alan was going to be able to come back. And in the meantime, Jeremy and I started climbing what we could. And, it's the way that weather works with mountains. You'll have these storms and then you'll have like 3 days of clear weather. And that's the window to go climb something. So that's kind of what Jeremy and I were doing. And while Alan was back in the States, Jeremy and I were climbing this mountain called Chopicalqui, and we ended up getting caught in an avalanche. This is a photo pretty much immediately after I dug Jeremy out of like a 6 foot deep hole in the snow.
So there was an avalanche and he literally got caught in it.
Absolutely. He got caught. We were climbing. It's probably 3 a.m., 4 a.m. It's all dark. And he triggered an avalanche, disappeared. And for those of you that might climb who are listening, you'll understand like a crevasse is kind of like this big crack in a glacier. And I was right below the crevasse. So thankfully the avalanche kind of drained into that crevasse. Otherwise it would have got me as well. And if it's one of those things, like if it happened 30 seconds later, we would have both been buried. But long story short, I was able to find him because we were connected to a rope. By the time I dug him out, or, not dug him out, but reached, uncovered his head about 6 feet, 6 feet down, he wasn't breathing. So there's a few stressful minutes of doing mouth-to-mouth CPR until he finally started breathing. So thankfully, Jeremy made it through that. It was a pretty close call. But that was one of the crazier things that happened in Peru while Alan was gone. So we're like, man, this trip is getting crazy. Jeremy almost died. Alan might not come back. He has like chronic Lyme disease. And right after this was kind of when Alan started improving, and he's, bought a plane ticket back, and things definitely started looking a little brighter. But
so even after two of you almost died and you kept going, I mean, what was it that kept you going through all of this?
I think part of it is, as a climber, you understand the risks involved. And even as a rider, you understand the risks involved. Like you have an accident on a motorcycle, you're not just going to stop riding. I mean, no worries if you do. I'm sure some people do. But that's kind of just all part of it. And you understand that going into something. It's like, yeah, this is kind of dangerous. I might get hurt, but it's worth the risk, right? And if it does happen, you kind of, brush it off and maybe take a little bit of time to recover and get back on the saddle. And that's the same way with climbing. It's like, we understand the risks. We were both pretty shaken up, considering a lot of people in the area died that season because it was just really unstable. But then we're like, I mean, this is what we signed up for. Let's get after it. So we start climbing again. But I think, that's kind of the way I see it. I think we all had a lot of close calls on the bikes, more close calls on the bikes than in the mountains. And it's one of those things where you're like, well, I'm still alive. Let's keep riding.
It's amazing. And we'll wrap up with just a few more questions and then we'll turn it over to the audience Q&A. But on that note, what was the worst wreck or the closest call you had bike-wise on the trip?
Yeah, so I actually had the worst wreck of my life, and definitely the worst wreck of the trip in Bolivia. And unfortunately, I wasn't GoProing at the time, so bummed. But I basically high sided at 65, 70 miles an hour on a high mountain pass in Bolivia. And it was kind of, you know, when you wreck, sometimes things move so fast. You're like, I broke my arm, I broke my leg, like I'm screwed. You kind of know immediately, like that was a gnarly wreck. And for those of you that don't know what a high side is, a low side is when you kind of like slide out, drop your bike, you know, it slides, you slide. But a high side is when you catch and catapult. And basically what was happening, we had a few hundred miles to do that day. So it's not like you can ride carefully through sketchy sections. You gotta kind of put in the time and just haul through everything. This is a high mountain pass. It was a muddy section. Jeremy and Alan went through the muddy section. Jeremy actually had a tank slapper because he got the wobs in the mud section. His bar slapped his tank, but he held it together. And I didn't have time to react because there was some cars coming. There's no one out there except these expedition rigs. So all these tourists were coming, and basically I wasn't able to go around it because they were there. So I hit the muddy section and high-sided, and thankfully and honestly, like a huge shout out to REV'IT here. I didn't break a bone. The rest of the day I had to ride a few hundred miles with one arm because I couldn't use my arm. But I firmly believe the only reason I didn't break anything was because of the armor in REV'IT here. So I think
and an incredible amount of luck, I think.
Yeah, I think I speak for everyone when you have a wreck like that and you come out of it unscathed. You're kind of just like committed to your gear for the rest of your life. You know what I mean? I'm just like, yeah, like I'll wear REV'IT till the day I die.
That's awesome.
But I'll share a video actually from not long after that. Hopefully, was it lagging on your end when I played these videos?
It's a little choppy, but I think it does help to get the idea of what you're.
Okay. So this video is right after Alan and Jeremy realized I wrecked, because sometimes you're riding, you know, and you're not on the comm system, so you go like 20 minutes or a few miles until you realize, oh, the guy's not behind me. And so this is when they came back, and these guys had helped me pick my bike up, and I was kind of here looking my wounds. And you have to understand, this is about like 14,000 feet in Bolivia. It's super cold, you know, and obviously riding with wind chill, it kicks it down to like, you know, mid-20s or something. So just all the
tourist expedition trucks who stopped to help.
Exactly. They kind of saw the whole thing. So this is Alan kind of coming to see what happened. And unfortunately, it's a little laggy. I'm not sure why. But yeah, this is kind of when I thought I might have still had a broken bone. But this just gives you a window into what it's like. It's kind of like you're covered in dirt. It's cold. You just want to get out of there, but you have 300 miles to go yet.
Everything looks covered in dirt. It has a nice patina.
Yeah, little nice patina. But yeah, thankfully, I think another shout out to our panniers. I think any type of hard luggage system I would have had would have just broken and cracked. But the leather panniers that we made, they kind of just take it in stride. You know, it's leather, so they don't really rip, they don't really break. And of course, we had plenty of other wrecks throughout the trip, but we were kind of all just like, how did this not break? It's pretty incredible.
Okay, well, we have some very curious audience members who are listening here. Before I ask a question, I just wanted to read one of the shout outs. We have PTRK PCMRK, who says, James, picked up on your journey and followed you throughout. You inspired me to start riding, and moto camping has become the complete passion of mine. When the plan started coming together, was there anything that made you think you wouldn't or shouldn't do the full trail? And what motivated you to stay on goal regardless of risks? I may have just combined two there. I'm not sure. I'm getting them.
Sure. I think the first question was kind of what were the second thoughts, essentially. Sure. I mean, definitely finances. It's one of those things where we weren't really wanting to kind of, you know, be fully sponsored or supported in this trip because we wanted to do our own thing. So pretty much the entire trip all of us were living on about a $10 per day budget. So in the States, that's kind of hard to swing, but you can swing it in South America or Latin America, it's a little easier because things are cheaper. So finances was like one thing. Obviously, like, yeah, just, I don't know. I think that was the biggest thing. I think we were also committed. We're like, we're going to do this. We've been talking about it since we were teenagers. Like nothing, we're going to do this come hell or high water. And what was the second question again? Sorry.
What did you do to stay motivated? So it was just a lot of like internal gumption. Like it was just in you to keep going.
I think so. I think we just had a drive and we're like willing to kind of put up with whatever came our way. I guess.
Steve Epi is asking, is there anything you would have done differently looking back on it? And are you glad you picked the DR650s?
Absolutely. I think one reason we picked the DR650s was because the cops or the police in South America are still using them. And I'll actually share a photo here of when we ran into a bunch of police that all had DR650s. Is pretty awesome. Let's see here.
Built-in bonding experience with the cops.
For sure. It's good to be in with the cops. So we kind of ran into like a whole bunch of police and like riot police. All these are DR650s. They were psyching on our bikes. There's a cop sitting on it. And this was in Colombia, actually. So pretty much a lot of Latin America, the cops are running DR650s. And if you know those bikes, they're exactly the same from 1996 to current year. So getting parts and all of that is kind of just easier than another bike. So I think for sure, if we did it again, we would run DR650s. But as far as like regrets, I think, or what I wish I had done differently, I think there's like, it's whenever you do a trip like this, it kind of comes up on you really fast and you do your best to prepare, but you know, it all of a sudden it's here. And I think like we kind of found our stride maybe halfway through, like in, you know, as we were heading into Mexico or something. So I guess in hindsight, I wish we would have had, you know, we kind of changed some of our gear setups, different sleeping bags, different this, different that, you know, just found our stride, and it took a little to do that. And I don't really know if I did a trip again, I kind of know exactly what I would use or do. But at the time, it's definitely like challenging going through so many different ecosystems, you know, going from like freezing weather in Alaska to the jungle. I mean, in Peru, we'd go from 14,000 feet to sea level in a matter of a few hours. So you're like freezing, you know, it's below freezing. And then you're in the jungle and you like want to rip all your clothes off. So that was kind of the challenging part, and finding what you need, you know, like such diverse gear was definitely like a big learning curve. But
very cool. And I think there was one major item that you said you could have definitely done without on the trip.
Yeah, man, shoot, I gotta share my screen again for this one. Let's see here. I definitely did not need my longbow. But I think like all of us,
that you were going to be like shooting buffalo or just like living off the land on this trip.
I mean, it would have been nice. I think we all we're like, let's just kind of, you know, the bow's fun to have. We didn't use it as much as we wanted. But I think this kind of gave off an impression that like, maybe, I mean, we only got robbed those 2 times, but we never had any other issues. We were all kind of wearing big knives. I had a bow, like we had a spear gun on the back of one bike. So I think that kind of helped us maybe stay safer sometimes, but definitely an unnecessary item, but I would recommend.
Someone asks, such dope photos. James, do you have any favorite images or moments or locations from your trip?
That's always a hard one. I think one of my favorite, because there's so many different genres, I think one of my favorite photos is this photo of Apamayo. We ended up actually not even climbing this due to, this is a little unstable. If you see here, you can see like an avalanche. That avalanche slid a couple days in a row while we were there. And it was just a little too unsafe considering that about a week before this, some people lost their lives on that same route and slide. So that was a big bummer, but this just kind of, I don't know, it's just such a special photo for me, knowing what it took to get there. You know, it's about a week to, you know, just get to this high camp here. And I think it kind of, to me, like this trip was so much less about like, it wasn't about let's ride to Ushuaia and then that's the kind of climax of the trip. It's obviously, it sounds cliche, but it's about the whole journey. It's about what you learn along the way. And I think especially for mountaineering and climbing, you learn a lot just about yourself and about, you know, relationships and everything in the process. So that's kind of what this mountain represents to me, or this photo represents to me.
Supermoto Central and Ryan M are both asking if you have any dream trips where you would like to do post-COVID, dream locations for the future.
Absolutely. I have a lot of climbing expeditions kind of cooking up. I have some, hopefully in the next few years, you'll probably see, but I have some climbing objectives in Afghanistan I want to do. There's some stuff in Canada I want to do. Hopefully getting back on Denali, which unfortunately they closed the season, obviously. So next year getting on the Cassine route on Denali. So a lot of my kind of big dreams right now are more climbing oriented, but definitely too many to count post-COVID.
Would you use a motorcycle to get to them again? Or would you go to the
Honestly, in Afghanistan, we might have to. It's kind of out there, so we'll see.
Wow, amazing. Zach Fletcher asks, what was the biggest breakdown on the road and any repairs you had to make on the bikes? Did you have any engine problems?
Poof, yeah, a lot. I actually got really lucky and didn't have any issues with my motor, which is crazy considering like we all bought, you know, late 90s DR650s on Craigslist. So this is a photo of the first time Alan was rebuilding his motor. This is on the side of the road in Patagonia. It was really cold. The reason that he was doing that, let me see if I can find this. Oh man. Shoot, I thought I had that photo. Actually, I think it's in a different folder. Here we go. So Alan's like some pieces from his carburetor broke off and got jammed in his valves. So we didn't know what happened at the time. Actually, his main bearing was pretty much completely shot towards the end of the trip, to the point where we had to run straight 50 weight oil in negative temperatures just to keep the, you know, keep things together because it was knocking so hard. This is this is a photo of Alan rebuilding the motor another time in an Airbnb in an evening. He literally just ripped it down to the bottom end, kind of, you know, it was insane. Actually, here's a time lapse. Did he know how
to make these repairs before the trip, or was he crowdsourcing these? Was he watching YouTube videos? Was he getting advice from locals?
I think it's a combination of everything. Alan's a mechanical engineer by trade, so he was definitely the go-to guy when it came to issues. Definitely the guy you want on a trip like this. So he unfortunately had like the brunt of issues. So whenever we would deal with something like electrical or mechanical, it already happened to him. So he'd be like, oh yeah, just do this, do that. So yeah, this is a time lapse of him like ripping the motor down in a matter of like half an hour. It's crazy. But yeah, I think our bikes were just falling apart by the end. Riding through the salt flats kind of just fried everything. So we started having electrical issues, but it just kind of got worse and worse. But thankfully we made it somehow. But I can't even I don't even know where to begin with the motor, with the issues we had.
It's very lucky you didn't have any. Everybody needs an Alan along on the trip.
Alan.
So we're going to wrap up here, but we had one last question from Tim Burke, who says, Avalanche, wow, is there a book coming?
Stay tuned is all I have to say. It's a little delayed, but there's definitely some stuff coming from this trip.
And can you let everybody know the best ways to follow your adventures and stay up to date on what you're up to now?
Absolutely. You can obviously follow me on social media on Instagram. My name is just James Barkman, and then I have a website, jamesbarkman.com. But to kind of stay up to date with current stuff, I think social media is the best way to do that. So yeah, that's a good way to kind of follow what's going on.
Great. And I just want to point out that James is actually live streaming from the inside of his sailboat where he is now living. So brand new adventures. James, you inspire us continually. For more on the REV'IT live stream series, please follow us at Instagram at REV'IT_adventure or REV'IT_official. You can always visit our website at www.revitsport.com. James, it has been such a pleasure talking to you. Amazing adventure. Thank you for keeping us streaming, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.